Marvitec é especialista em estruturas metálicas e possui a mais completa linha de produtos para a segurança viária. Amplo parque industrial com equipamentos de última geração, oferecendo a nossos parceiros maior qualidade e agilidade na área de segurança viária. A Marvitec firma o compromisso para o desenvolvimento de toda a infraestrutura do país. Seja nosso parceiro você também. Acesse nosso site www.marvitec.com.br.
A gente tem agora o diretor da ABSEV, o senhor Jorge Tanuri, que vai falar sobre segurança viária. Vamos chamar ele, a gente vai entrar com ele online no nosso link. Já temos o link dele, do Jorge? Oi, Jorge, como vai?
Boa tarde pessoal.
Tudo bem?
Graças a Deus, tudo bem.
Tá ouvindo?
Espero que todos estejam seguros e com saúde.
Por aqui tudo ótimo. Você tá ouvindo bem a gente?
Perfeito.
Posso chamar o Guilherme para falar com você?
Será um prazer.
Então, ó, você tá ao vivo, hein? Vem pra cá, Guilherme Ramos, para bater esse papo com o Jorge. E daqui a pouco a gente tem perguntas para você, Jorge.
Obrigado.
Tudo bem, Jorge?
Olá, Guilherme. Tudo bom?
Nós vamos falar de segurança viária ou de futebol?
Olha, é melhor falar de segurança viária, porque o nosso time não está nada bom.
É verdade, é verdade. Bom, Jorge, obrigado pela presença da ABSEV, por todo o suporte que vocês dão para a gente. Para quem não conhece a ABSEV, o Jorge vai falar um pouquinho de quem é a ABSEV e qual o papel dela no mercado aí, né, Jorge?
Bom, é isso aí. Guilherme, primeiro eu queria parabenizar a você e a toda a sua equipe por fazer um evento tão grandioso e vir falar desse assunto de trânsito que é tão importante no Brasil. Parabéns, está sendo um sucesso e guarde essa frase, a sorte segue a coragem.
É isso aí, obrigado. E quem não sabe, o Jorge também é diretor da World Center também, que é um dos nossos expositores aqui, sempre apoiou as iniciativas que a gente faz e é uma satisfação imensa poder estar com vocês aqui. Mandar um abraço para o Mário, que é o presidente também da ABSEV, para a Luciana, que ajudou bastante a gente. Jorge, do que nós vamos falar hoje aqui?
Bom, vamos lá. Eu vou falar rapidamente da ABSEV, Associação Brasileira de Segurança Viária. Foi uma associação que foi fundada em 2012 com o intuito de falar de segurança viária. Hoje nós somos em torno de 20 e poucos fabricantes, laboratórios, apoiadores, tentando falar desse assunto que é tão importante no nosso cenário brasileiro. Hoje, infelizmente, morre muita gente no trânsito do Brasil. O trânsito do Brasil mata muito, além de tudo, custa muito caro para o Brasil. É um ralo onde se perde milhões e milhões. Chegam a falar em estudos, até em trilhão de real. Então, assim, claro que ninguém senta numa mesa de bar ou num happy hour, num restaurante e vamos falar de acidente de trânsito? Ninguém gosta do assunto. Mas é muito importante e a gente tem que discutir. De novo, parabéns, Guilherme, e pode contar com a ABSEV aqui, porque a nossa maior intenção é reduzir esse monte de acidente que acontece no Brasil.
É isso aí, Jorge. E qual que vai ser Você que vai apresentar o nosso palestrante agora, né, que vai falar aí da experiência dele, como é que você está vendo isso?
Legal. Guilherme, antes de chamar o nosso palestrante internacional, eu só queria comentar que a ABSEV hoje ela faz parte dos principais órgãos de trânsito do Brasil, ajudando os principais órgãos de trânsito no Brasil. Temos uma cadeira na Câmara Temática do CONTRAN, que é o nosso órgão máximo consultivo e normativo no Brasil. Foi falado ontem, o ministro, aí também, na parte do IRAP também. Estamos lá para ajudar o IRAP. Fazemos parte das células de trabalho que o Observatório Nacional de Segurança Viária está fazendo para apresentar para o Brasil, para o Ministério do Transporte, algumas soluções para redução de trânsito, tá? E decidimos trazer nada mais do que um técnico com mais de 30 e tantos anos de experiência nesse setor, um técnico americano, para falar sobre segurança viária, porque hoje a segurança viária ela se baseia nos 3E'S, Education, Engineering, Enforcement, educação, engenharia e o outro é fiscalização. Isso é muito importante para o Brasil. A gente tem excelentes engenheiros, a educação precisa melhorar, mas a nossa fiscalização está deixando muito a desejar. A gente só vai diminuir acidente no Brasil, fiscalizando produtos de qualidade lá na rodovia, fiscalizando velocidade, vendo se estão produtos de acordo com as normas das quais o Brasil utiliza. E, para isso, a gente convidou o Juan Morales, que ele faz parte da ATSA. A ATSA é o nosso parceiro americano, que eles têm em torno de 1.200 associados, é uma entidade gigantesca, com muita força, e a gente tem que se espelhar em quem realmente faz sucesso. Os Estados Unidos, com toda aquela frota, consegue reduzir e ter índices de acidentes menores. Então, o Juan Morales é um parceiro, já convidamos ele 2, 3 vezes, já esteve aqui no Brasil, fez algumas apresentações espetaculares e ele vai explicar hoje um pouquinho sobre esse conceito de 3S.
E é a primeira palestra internacional que nós estamos recebendo aqui esse ano na Paving. E realmente eu já conheço o trabalho do Juan Morales, tudo que ele tem feito, a ATSA, né, que é a associação bem importante nos Estados Unidos, tem eventos bem importantes também, que a gente já teve lá. Acho que o ano passado, se eu não me engano, foi em Tampa. É isso, Jorge? Né?
Tampa, acho que sim, acho que foi isso.
E então eu convido você a chamar ele para estar aqui com a gente.
Espero que vocês gostem, prestem bastante atenção. E com vocês, Juan Morales. Parabéns mais uma vez, sucesso.
Há quase uma década promovendo ações para a valorização de produtos, tecnologias e normas para o estabelecimento de padrões de qualidade para as vias de transporte. A ABSEV é formada por empresas brasileiras, pioneiras na fabricação de produtos para a segurança viária. Com atuação direta junto a entidades nacionais e internacionais, além de órgãos governamentais, promovendo a cooperação a fim de oferecer suporte aos associados e estímulo ao desenvolvimento do sistema viário no Brasil. A ABSEV participa ativamente de todos os eventos da área, além de promover uma série de reuniões e seminários técnicos com representantes de todos os setores. Neste ano, a ABSEV realiza a campanha Zona de Obra Segura para Todos, com o objetivo de difundir a importância da segurança para os trabalhadores e usuários de vias. Saiba mais sobre as vantagens em se tornar um associado. Acesse www.absev.org.br.
Hello, my name is Juan Morales. I would like to welcome all of you to my short presentation on traffic safety, specifically for the vulnerable road users. I would like to thank ABSEV for their invitation. It's an honor for me to be here, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. What I would like to do in my time with you is to give you an overview of traffic safety, specifically some of the countermeasures that are available to improve highway safety. Specifically, and I would like to concentrate on pedestrian safety, because I know pedestrian safety is one of the most difficult things that we do in traffic engineering. So my presentation today, I'm going to cover or discuss my countermeasures around what I like to call the 3E, or the 3E's concept, which are engineering countermeasures, education countermeasures, and enforcement countermeasures. Of course, as an engineer myself, I want to emphasize engineering countermeasures, but I will discuss education and enforcement countermeasures. In a way of presentation, I'm a traffic engineer. I am with Morales and Associates out of Orlando, Florida. I am originally from Puerto Rico, so I speak a little bit of Portuguese, Spanish for sure, but I've been in the US for over 40 years. And my experience has been mostly in the US, but also with the World Bank. I do consulting for the World Bank, and I have the opportunity to go to Brazil multiple times to work on projects there. So I love Brazil, and I wish we could be doing this in person, but of course, because of the pandemic, that is impossible. But you have my contact information on the screen after the presentation. If you have any questions, or if I can help you in any way, just feel free to send me an email or visit our website. So, as I said, my presentation today is going to be based, concentrating on pedestrians and bicyclists, what I like to call vulnerable road users, or VRUs. Obviously, what is vulnerable? Someone that is capable of susceptible to being hurt, wounded, in this case, in a traffic crash. You know, when I teach this face-to-face, people tell me, but drivers are also vulnerable. And that is true, but they're not the most vulnerable. Pedestrians and bicyclists are more vulnerable, of course, because they're exposed. They're completely exposed. Their limbs, their arms and legs are exposed. And of course, if they get impacted by a vehicle, the probability of dying is much higher. And that's why I wanted to emphasize pedestrians in this class. As you can see, a pedestrian fatality, if you've ever seen one, is something that you will never forget, because these crashes and fatalities can be obviously lethal. You can obviously get killed, and that's going to be one of the countermeasures that you're going to hear from me, which is lowering the speeds, because they like to say speed kills, and that is entirely true. Speed would kill you. So later on, we're going to talk about traffic calming and some other ways to minimize traffic speeds. I would say right now, because of these things, smartphones, pedestrian safety is at one of its worst moments. Everyone is texting, drivers are texting, pedestrians are texting, bicyclists are texting. And because of that, I would say that right now, pedestrian safety has increased dramatically. Here in the US, we were doing so well. Pedestrian fatalities were dropping. And in around the year 2009, they started to go up again. And now we're worse than we were, I would say, 20 years ago. And the reason for that is because of the iPhone. Of course, the iPhone was released in 2008. And if you know who you are, everyone is texting. Chances are some of you are texting right now as you listen to me. And you know, we cannot avoid it, but texting is going to be our worst enemy. And bicycles, I'm not going to have a lot of time today to discuss bicycles, but bicycles in several countries, their share mode is small, because people fear being on a bicycle. A lot of people feel that if you're on a bicycle, you're competing with cars, you're competing with buses, you're competing with other motor vehicles. And because of that, bicyclists don't feel safe. And perhaps the bicycles are not used as much as perhaps they should be used, not only for exercise, but also to minimize emissions into the air, and and other advantages of bicycles. Again, who's going to win this battle? Obviously, vehicles would win the battle every time. Vehicles have a mass, they're traveling at speed, and if you're going to compete a pedestrian and a vehicle, of course, the vehicle is going to win every single time. And that's why pedestrian safety is so important. And I would like to share some ideas with you today. Again, the problem is that these vulnerable road users are going to be in close proximity to vehicles. And of course, they're going to be in a high-risk situation, which is going to lead to a lot of fatalities. And of course, in developing countries, for instance, a country like Colombia, where I have done some work, I think pedestrian fatalities account for more than 50% of the traffic fatalities. So again, why is that? A lot of times we blame the behavior, but it's also because, as I said, pedestrians are going to be more vulnerable. And again, the problem is that those vulnerable users are not at risk to drivers. Drivers, of course, have the advantage, and drivers behave like that, where they sometimes threaten the pedestrians with erratic maneuvers. Another problem with pedestrians, as I said, that a lot of times pedestrians get blamed. We blame their behavior. Crossing illegally is a common excuse, and that's not the way we need to address this. A lot of times the behavior is induced or caused by improper design, and that's one of the things I wanted to discuss with you today. Give you an idea of what those designs would be. I think this is changing a little bit. Worldwide, I think we have the concept of complete streets. If you don't know what that is basically designing for all users, not just designing for cars, but designing for pedestrians, providing bicycle lanes like you see in this picture. Anything you see in green here would be a bicycle lane. You can see more medians, more pedestrian refuge, other ways of encouraging people to walk so they can feel safe, specifically in an urban environment. So we have many ways to do this. Some of these strategies are preventive. Of course, that means before the crash occurs. Other ones are reactive. We have to wait for us to have a pattern of crashes before we can choose the proper countermeasure or remedy that we propose to use. Preventive countermeasures are nice, of course, because you do it before the crash, but disadvantages is that politicians may not see a problem, because if the crash never took place, the politician would say, we don't have a problem. So justify funding for preventive countermeasures could be a challenge. More common are reactive countermeasures, because the problem is already documented, and for that we're going to need data. We're going to need some kind of crash data. So typically that's the approach I'm going to propose. Identify where we're going to intervene, do some kind of an inspection so we know what the conditions are, diagnose the problem, propose countermeasures or remedies, assess and select which ones we're going to go with, implement it, evaluate, and then repeat. So it's always an ongoing process. So let's discuss some of these countermeasures that I'm referring to. I always think of countermeasures as a toolbox of things, remedies that we can apply to eliminate the specific type of crash. In this case, pedestrian safety. Now, as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, we're going to have to evaluate, do some kind of before and after. And for me to do this, I'm going to need data. And some of the data could be, we can look at all crashes. We can look at what we call KSIs. KSIs are crashes that involve people getting killed or seriously injured, and the severity of those crashes. And we're going to rank those crashes and come up with a pattern so we can apply the proper countermeasure. So one index that I like is the so-called severity index, which is a ratio of crashes involving people getting killed or seriously injured to the total number of crashes. This is an excellent measure to use because you cannot just look at the number of crashes. There are a couple of remedies or countermeasures that would actually increase the number of crashes, but would decrease the severity of those crashes. So that's why I like the SI quite a bit, because again, I would not look at just total number of crashes, because that might not be representative of how effective these countermeasures may be. We also need to collect data in terms of the type of crash, all the things to see on the screen, the time of day, day of the week, etc., the weather conditions, the age of the victims, and of course, the speed. The type of crash is going to be extremely important because once you have a pattern of crashes, it's much easier to choose the proper countermeasures because you can identify types of crashes that are overrepresented. And I'm going to give you some examples in my presentation today. So again, what we're trying to do is identify the types of crashes that we have, and then look at the countermeasures, evaluate and look at the countermeasures that could potentially eliminate or minimize those crashes. There are a couple of ways of doing this. Some of them are rather simple. One that I like to use is developing a condition diagram. Nowadays with Google Earth and Google Maps, this is much easier, but this is basically a drawing that shows the conditions on the highway, including businesses nearby. Like in this case, we have a store and we have a gas station. Why do we need to show that? Well, because both of those examples are going to generate trips. And that would, for instance, you may have people walking from the gas station to the store, and that would generate crashes in this area. So don't forget land use. Don't just look at the highways. You need to look at nearby land use as well. And in this case, notice that there's also vegetation, because vegetation may be reducing the line of sight and may create crashes. So the condition diagram will show all of that. It's an excellent tool. Once we have the condition diagram, we can then develop a collision diagram. We can use standard symbols like the ones you see here. This is fairly rudimentary, but it's extremely effective. For instance, here's a typical collision diagram. And you can see that it will show the types of crashes that we have. For example, you see these circles? If the circle is white, that means that was a crash without a fatality. If the circle is dark or black, that would be a crash that involved a fatality. But just by looking at this briefly, I can see a lot of rear end crashes over here. I can see a lot of left turn crashes over here. So I can tell that chances are this is a traffic signal problem, or it could be a visibility problem over here in the north. So again, it's a very simple tool that could be very, very effective. And then you can see at the bottom right here that how we develop a little table summarizing the types of crashes. How many were fatal, how many involved injuries, and how many were PDO. PDO stands for property damage only. In other words, only damage to the property or to the vehicle, no injuries. So let me get into the countermeasures briefly. Again, I just don't have a lot of time today, but I just wanted to whet your appetite on how these countermeasures would work. And all of these countermeasures I'm going to give you have what we call a CRF. The CRF stands for crash reduction factor. This is kind of an old terminology. Nowadays we use MDF for, no, CMF for crash modification, no, crash modification factor, but now we used to use crash reduction factors because that would assume that we reduce the number of crashes. But as I said earlier, it's possible the number of crashes would go up. And for that reason, a CFR is not the best term. And nowadays we use crash modification factor because you will modify, sometimes it could be higher, sometimes it could be lower. I'm gonna organize my presentation around the 3E's. And again, that's because these 3 ways in the English language, they all start with the letter E: engineering, education, and enforcement. And again, I'm going to try to emphasize engineering countermeasures. These are countermeasures that would be affected by the design of the roadway itself. And again, you may have to retrofit, you may existing roadways, but if you're going to build new highways, these are some things that I want you to consider to improve the safety of the vulnerable road users. One of them is speed management. Obviously, controlling the speed, especially in urban areas, is an obvious countermeasure. Obviously, speed kills. We say that a lot, but that is so true. I don't know if you know this, but if the speed is higher than 40 kilometers per hour and you get hit by a car, your probability of surviving is less than 5%. As you can see here, the probability of death on the y-axis, you can see if the speed is, let's say 60 kilometers an hour, you get hit by a car, you can see that the probability of dying is 90%. In other words, you only have like a 5% chance of surviving that crash. And that's why number 1 countermeasure is lower speeds. So how are we going to lower speeds? I know some of you would think about using signs like speed limit signs, but those things simply don't work. People speed a lot. People just don't follow the law. So what we're going to do is force people to slow down. How do I force you to slow down? Well, we use what we call traffic calming techniques. And these are, what is traffic calming? You can see some examples on the screen, but traffic calming is basically forcing you to lower the speed through geometric features, through geometric things. For instance, we can have speed humps, which is like an undulation that will force you to slow down, would it? I'm going to show you some examples. Roundabouts, of course, are becoming more popular all over the world because a roundabout eliminates the traffic signal. And of course, a roundabout is going to minimize the number of conflict points. I'm going to discuss that a little bit later. But again, traffic calming is not saying, please, please slow down. Traffic calming is, I'm going to force you to slow down through a geometric design and through geometric features. So let me look at some of these briefly. Most of these are intended to be used in residential areas. Because why is that? Because residential areas is where the pedestrians would be. Obviously, you would not use any of these countermeasures on freeways or high-speed roadways. They're intended to be used in low-speed residential areas and neighborhoods most of the time. So let me show you some of these. I don't have time to go through all of these, but you can always Google these things and find what these are. So I just want to emphasize 2 or 3 of these. And one example is creating mid-block refuge for pedestrians. This is something that is not typically done in Latin American countries, but it's something that it could be so effective because notice that in this case, the pedestrian refuge is kind of forcing traffic to slow down by creating this island. And what that does, it allows the pedestrian to cross the road in 2 stages. What happens a lot of times is that a pedestrian will look to the left and get hit from the right, or you look to the right and you hit from the left. So a pedestrian refuge is nice in the sense that you can cross in 2 stages, which is also excellent for people with disabilities or people on wheelchairs or with visual disabilities. It also minimizes the distance that I have to cross. The shorter the distance I have to cross is, the safer that intersection will be. Now, here's an example of a mid-block refuge. Obviously, for me to justify this, I need to have heavy pedestrian volume mid-block. A common application of this would be, there's a bus stop here and there's a shopping center here. So obviously pedestrians would not go around, they're gonna cut through. So that would be a good application for a mid-block refuge. A curb extension is another one. The idea of a curb extension is to, as I said, make the distance that I have to cross shorter. And what it does, it extends close to the intersection. It creates an extension of the sidewalk. And that will make the pedestrian more visible. And notice that it's going to force traffic to slow down because of a narrow road. And it minimizes the distance that I have to cross. So curb extensions are excellent. Again, they could be a problem for bicyclists because, again, you're reducing the width. But you can see how effective curb extensions would be in urban areas, as opposed, you can see we're extending the curb at the intersection, and that creates a much shorter distance for me to cross. And because of that, that will be much safer for the pedestrians and more inviting for me to walk. The turning radius of that intersection is extremely critical. This is something that is not that obvious, but you can see here in this intersection, we have a large turning radius. When you have a large turning radius, what that does, it allows vehicles to make this turn at a much higher speed. I don't really have to slow down. And so drivers will be looking at the left while turning to the right. And that's when they would impact the pedestrians. So something for you to consider would be to reduce the turning radius. As you can see on the right, a much smaller turning radius would force traffic to slow down. And again, it would have the added benefit of creating a shorter distance that I have to walk. You can see in this picture how if you had a larger turning radius, the distance you would have to cross is much longer. Plus, as I said, turning vehicles can turn faster. So that would be 2 problems: high speeds, longer distance to cross. So by reducing the turning radius, seems to me that's an excellent countermeasure. And by the way, don't forget to account for parked vehicles. Notice in this picture how the turning radius is quite small, but vehicles can turn at a much higher, longer radius because we allow parked vehicles close to the intersection. So in this picture, what I would do is perhaps combine this with a curb extension. Curb extensions would help in that regard. Another one is eliminating the right turn on red. It says on the screen that right turn on red is the pedestrian's enemy. I just don't know if in Brazil we have right turn on red prohibitions, but right turn on red is the pedestrian's worst enemy. As I said, the problem with this is that drivers will be turning right while looking to the left. And because of that, they're going to impact a lot of pedestrians in this area. So what I would suggest is that if you have a lot of pedestrians, typically downtown, urban areas, that you would prohibit right turn on red. I don't know if you know, but if you go to New York City, in New York City, there's no right turn on red anywhere in the city of New York. It's not permitted. Why is that? Well, because in New York, we have extreme pedestrian volumes. So it'd be like Sao Paulo, a place like that. It'd be extreme urban areas. So consider eliminating the right turn on red. Access management is another one. It's basically minimizing the number of conflict points. What is a conflict point? It's basically where the path of two users would cross. This could be two vehicles, two pedestrians, or a vehicle and a pedestrian. So obviously, the fewer conflict points, the safer the intersection would be, because it eliminates conflicts between pedestrians and vehicles. For instance, this gas station that you see here, you can see all these access points. Every single one of those access points is a conflict point between pedestrians and a vehicle. So if I can consolidate conflict points by eliminating entrances, that would be a good thing, because I minimize the number of conflict points. So for this to work, I'm going to need planning ordinances where the city would control how many access points gas stations would have. And again, the idea is to consolidate the number of access points that we have. For instance, in this McDonald's, there's only 3 access points as opposed to multiple access points, and these would be one way. So by having one-way access points, that's also a good thing, because you're eliminating conflict points. So I think I discussed this. So what we're trying to do is consolidate driveways, eliminate or restrict turning, especially turning to the left. If you can eliminate left turns, you can do this through signs, or you can do this through signal phasing, or you could do this through traffic calming. But if we can eliminate the left turn, we're going to have a much safer highway. I don't know if you know this, but here's an example of, we have 3 driveways, and all 3 driveways allow the left turn. And we have what we call a dual left turn lane here on the left. I notice that we've done in this to the right, perfect access management. We consolidated 3 driveways into one, and now we force everyone to make a right turn. We call that right in, right out. You can only get in and out by making a right turn. Notice that in this case, through a median, we have eliminated the left turn. Why is that? Here's an example what right in, right out would do for us. Notice that if we allow the left turn, we have 11 conflict points. If we go right in, right out only, we only have 6. So just by doing that, we eliminated about half of the conflict points. Great technique, and you're going to see more and more of that, elimination of the left turn. As you can see, the red turn allows for almost 50% of crashes at intersections, 47% in this example. So if we can eliminate the left turn, that's going to be better for everyone, not only vehicles, but also for pedestrians. So here's an example of the same thing. On the top, you see the uncontrolled intersections, left, you can make left turns. At the bottom, through traffic calming, we have consolidated, we have eliminated the left turn. And someone's going to say, wait a minute, that's going to create congestion. Well, that could be the case, but what happens is people will make a right turn, and then they will make a U-turn here. They will make a U-turn at the next intersection. So it's not that we're going to eliminate all left turns. Of course, that's impossible, but we're going to eliminate some of them. I think that's a good thing. Speed humps, a lot of people call these bumps, but a bump is semicircular. The speed hump is more like an undulation. I would say this is by far the most popular traffic calming measure in the US. And I'm not a speed hump. I'm not a big fan of these, but they could be very effective. The problem that you may have is emergency vehicles like police and fire trucks accessing neighborhoods. that could be a problem, but these could be quite effective because they lower the speed. And the beauty of the speed hump, not to be confused with a speed bump, that these allow you to maintain kind of a speed that is fairly close to the speed limit, as opposed to a speed bump that forces you to go to 0 and then you accelerate, creating noise. So that's why speed bumps are a no-no and speed humps are the way to go. But they're not the same. Humps are yes, bumps are no. Similar to that is what we call a speed table. These I like a lot. It's basically a combination of two things. You raise the crosswalk. So for the vehicles, it becomes a speed bump, a speed hump for the vehicles, and for the pedestrians, it makes the pedestrians more visible. So you basically get 2 for 1. These are ones that I like a lot. Most of the projects I've done, I end up always recommending these because they give you, as I said, 2 for 1. They lower the speeds of the vehicles and they make the pedestrians more visible and therefore more safe. So I highly recommend speed tables. You can do a similar approach is just raising the entire intersection. This could be a little bit more costly, but it could be extremely effective, where you raise the entire intersection, especially if the intersection is stop control. Because you know how people don't stop at the stop sign? This would force them to slow down at the very least. Traffic circle is something I like. Notice that this is not to be confused with a humongous traffic circle. This is not a roundabout. This is a fairly small circle in the middle of the intersection. And again, what that allows you to do is to be able, you would have to slow down to go through this intersection. So the number of crashes may go up, but the severity of the crash is going to go way down because you have to slow down to go through this intersection. And again, before you implement these things, make sure you check with the fire department, police, ambulances to make sure that this is okay for them. So a circle is not a roundabout. A roundabout is much larger. In Latin America, they call them óvalos or redondeles. I don't know the term in Brazil. It could be an oval. But again, the one on the left is a traffic circle, which is fairly small. You don't need to purchase any more land. The one on the right, again, allows you to go around and eliminates the 90-degree angle crash. In the US, we call that a T-bone because it's a T crash. So that's why roundabouts are becoming more and more popular worldwide. A lot of drivers don't like them because they don't understand them. But again, if you explain the benefits of a roundabout, to me, they're excellent. It eliminates the signal, eliminates the T crash, and it forces traffic to go around. You cannot just go through there at a very high speed. I think in a nutshell, those are my engineering countermeasures. I only have a few minutes left, so I wanted to tell you about the other 2 E's. Education countermeasures, they play an important role. Who are we going to educate? Well, the answer is all of the above. We need to educate engineers. We need to educate the public. We need to educate the police. We need to educate everyone. The problem with these so-called public education campaigns is that they take a long time to yield dividends, to produce results, and they're very short time frame of success. People change for a while, and eventually it's like going on a diet. You change your diet, but after a while you go back to the old diet. It's very similar. People will slow down for a while and then they go back to normal. So I would encourage you not to depend on these. I'm not saying don't use them, but you got to be aware that they're benefits could be short-lived. Yeah, if you're going to do it, target specific audiences like children, or no texting, or no driving, no drunk driving or DUI, driving under the influence. You should target specific audiences. Again, that could be effective, but it's going to take some time to put in practice. To give an idea, in the US, the use of seatbelts was about 75% in 1980. And it's been 40 years since 1980, and now it's up to 93%. And that's through heavy education campaigns. So it took us 40 years to change that behavior. That's why we cannot rely just on education programs. And again, be specific to the audience that you're trying to target. Here's some examples for you. Specifically for pedestrians or bicyclists. The last E is enforcement. That means obviously giving tickets. It could be automated enforcement through red light running cameras and other techniques. But the problem with enforcement, very similar to education, is that these techniques may not be effective if the enforcement is not there. So you're going to need personnel, and the moment people realize that there is no police there, they go back to normal. And nowadays, with Waze and technology, people know that there's a policeman or a police officer there. And so these things may not be as effective as you think. That's why, as an engineer, of course, I'm not a police officer. If you are, you probably disagree with me. But if you are an engineer, I would emphasize the engineering countermeasures. But again, they could have short-term effects unless combined with engineering and education countermeasures. But don't forget to also educate the police themselves, so they know, for instance, why we're doing what we're doing. And so the education of the officers is extremely important. Officers are drivers themselves, and a lot of times they don't know or understand what we're trying to do from the engineering perspective. So it's always important to also educate the officers. And again, try to target specific behavior like drunk driving, texting while driving, etc. Target specific behavior, speeding, of course. And some of the aggressive driving, red light running, failure to yield to pedestrians, which of course is a problem. And as I said, distracted driving. Well, my friends, I think that's pretty much all the time that I have to be with you. I wish I could have been there in person to enjoy the conference with you. But what I've done, I gave you an idea of some countermeasures that we can use to improve safety, specifically concentrating on pedestrian safety. And I frame my presentation around the 3E's: engineering, enforcement, and education countermeasures. Don't give up. It's something that we have to do to improve safety. Again, thank you for your time, and I wish I could have been there with you. Enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you. Obrigado.
Maravilha! Essa foi a participação do...
Peraí, vamos voltar.
Maravilha! Essa foi a participação do Juan Morales. É isso aí. E agora a gente vai voltar com o Jorge Tanuri, né? Jorge, tá aí ainda? Cadê você, Jorge?
Sempre presente,
É isso aí.
Franco.
E agora a gente vai voltar com o Jorge Tanuri, né? Jorge, tá aí ainda? Cadê você, Jorge? Tá ouvindo a gente, Jorge?
Sempre
É
presente,
isso aí.
ouvindo.
E agora a gente vai voltar com o Jorge Tanuri, né? Jorge, tá aí ainda? Acho que a gente tá com um probleminha técnico, supernatural. Navegar pela
Que
internet
já foi
é isso
resolvido,
mesmo.
acho.
Resolvido? Vamos lá, tá ouvindo bem a gente, Jorge?
Tô ouvindo bem.
Então, vamos continuar a PV com você.
Diretamente da rodovia, né, Jorge?
Exatamente, essa é uma rodovia super segura.
Essa aí, pô, Jorge, muito legal ouvir o Juan Morales, um cara com uma experiência incrível, né? O que eu achei importante também, não adianta a gente educar só o motorista, só os órgãos, temos que educar também a polícia, quem fiscaliza, né? Que, como ele disse, também são motoristas, né?
Exato, ele foi no final super assertivo. Quem trabalha com trânsito, não desista. A gente não pode desistir. Eu já estou nessa estrada há mais de 26 anos e a gente... É muito triste alguém perder um ente querido na rodovia ou em algum acidente, né? Aliás, existe um movimento muito grande no Brasil para se mudar esse nome. Não é acidente. Acidente a gente não pode evitar. Tem algumas coisas que estão mudando para sinistro. Em alguns casos a gente poderia evitar.
É isso
Boa
aí.
observação, muito bom, é isso aí.
Jorge, mais uma vez queria agradecer a ABSEV, queria agradecer você especificamente, ao World Center, todo mundo, a Luciana, ao Mário, que deve estar aí assistindo a gente. Muito obrigado mesmo, um abraço, espero que a gente esteja junto em março do ano que vem e presencialmente agora.
Se Deus quiser. Parabéns mais uma vez aí, Guilherme, pela iniciativa. Franco, parabéns.
Obrigado.
Pode ficar sempre com a gente.
A gente te espera o ano que vem presencial, hein? Lá na Expo.
E vamos torcer bastante hoje à noite.
Aí já fica mais difícil.
Marvitec é especialista em estruturas metálicas e possui a mais completa linha de produtos para a segurança viária. Amplo parque industrial com equipamentos de última geração, oferecendo a nossos parceiros maior qualidade e agilidade na área de segurança viária. A Marvitec firma o compromisso para o desenvolvimento de toda a infraestrutura do país. Seja nosso parceiro você também. Acesse nosso site www.marvitec.com.br.